The crack of ice splitting beneath her feet was the last sound Delilah Drake heard before the frozen surface of the Montezuma River gave way, and she plunged into water so cold it felt like 1,000 knives stabbing into her flesh all at once. The current was stronger than anyone could have imagined beneath that deceptively solid-looking surface, and within seconds, the river had pulled her under the remaining sheet of ice, trapping her in a twilight world of gray-green water and impenetrable frozen ceiling above. She clawed at the underside of the ice, her lungs already screaming for air, her heavy woolen skirts dragging her down like an anchor determined to pull her to the riverbed below. It was January of 1884, and Delilah had only been in Montezuma, Colorado for 3 months, having traveled from Philadelphia after her father's dry goods business had gone bankrupt. At 22 years old, she had accepted a position as a schoolteacher in this rough mining town nestled high in the Rocky Mountains, desperate for work and willing to go anywhere that would have her. She had been warned about the treacherous winter conditions, about how the altitude made everything more dangerous, about how the cold here was different from the cold back east. But she had needed to fetch water from the river because the pump at the schoolhouse had frozen solid, and she had thought she could make it across the ice to where the bucket had fallen the day before. She had been wrong. Her vision was starting to go dark around the edges when suddenly the ice above her exploded inward, and a strong hand grabbed the front of her dress, hauling her upward with such force that she burst through the surface gasping and choking. Arms wrapped around her from behind, dragging her across the breaking ice toward the shore, and she could hear a man's voice saying something she could not quite make out over the roaring in her ears. Then she was on the snowy bank, and someone was wrapping a heavy coat around her shoulders, rubbing her arms vigorously, and she finally managed to focus her eyes on the face of the man who had saved her life. He was probably around 25 or 26, with dark hair that curled slightly where it stuck out from under his hat, and eyes the color of summer grass, despite the winter landscape surrounding them. His face was all strong angles and weathered skin, the face of someone who spent his life outdoors in all kinds of weather. Water dripped from his clothes, and his lips had already taken on a bluish tinge, but his hands never stopped moving, trying to create warmth through friction as he looked at her with an intensity that made something flutter in her chest, despite the cold that had seeped into her very bones. "Can you hear me?" he asked, his voice rough but urgent. "Miss, can you hear me? We need to get you somewhere warm right now or you are going to die." Delilah tried to nod, but her whole body was shaking so violently that she could barely control her movements. The man looked around quickly, then made a decision. He stood, scooping her up into his arms as though she weighed nothing, and started running toward the cluster of buildings that made up the town. She wanted to protest, wanted to say she could walk, but her jaw was clenched so tightly from the shivering that she could not form words. Instead, she found herself pressing against his chest, seeking any warmth she could find, even though his clothes were as soaked and frozen as her own. He kicked open the door of what turned out to be the boarding house, where Delilah rented a small room on the second floor, startling Mrs. Patterson, who ran the establishment. The older woman took one look at them and immediately sprang into action, years of living in mining country having prepared her for all manner of emergencies. Within minutes, Delilah was upstairs in her room with Mrs. Patterson peeling off her frozen clothes, while the man who had saved her built up the fire in the small stove until the metal glowed red. Another boarder brought hot water and blankets, and soon Delilah was wrapped in layers of wool and sitting as close to the stove as she could manage without catching fire. The man had stepped out while Mrs. Patterson helped her change into dry clothes, But now he returned, also changed into dry things though they hung oddly on his frame, and she realized he must have borrowed them from someone else in the house. He knelt down beside her chair, studying her face with those green eyes, and she saw the concern there that went beyond polite worry for a stranger. His hand came up as though he wanted to touch her face, check for himself that she was real and alive, but he caught himself and lowered it again. "That was the stupidest thing I have ever seen anyone do," he said, but there was no anger in his voice, only residual fear. "That ice has been melting and refreezing for weeks. Nobody in their right mind walks on it." "I needed water," Delilah managed to say through chattering teeth. "The pump is frozen." "Then you ask someone to help you," he said firmly. "You do not go out on unstable ice by yourself. You could have died. You nearly did die." "But I did not," she said, looking directly at him. "Because you saved me. I do not even know your name." He sat back on his heels, and for the first time a small smile crossed his face, transforming his features from merely handsome to something that made her heart skip a beat. "Isaac Osborne," he said. "I run cattle up in the high country during the summer, work odd jobs around town in the winter. I was heading to the general store when I saw you go through the ice." "Delilah Drake," she replied. "I teach at the school, and I owe you my life, Mr. Osborne." "Isaac," he corrected. "And you do not owe me anything except a promise that you will never do anything that foolish again, Mrs. Patterson bustled in with hot broth and honey-sweetened tea, shooing Isaac away so Delilah could rest, but not before he had extracted that promise from her. As he stood to leave, he paused at the door and looked back at her, something unreadable in his expression. Then he was gone, and Delilah was left with her tea and the memory of strong arms pulling her from certain death, of green eyes full of fear and relief, and something else she did not yet dare name. The doctor came later that afternoon and pronounced her remarkably lucky, with no signs of frostbite beyond some minor damage to her fingertips that would heal with time. He ordered her to rest for several days, and Delilah found herself with little to do but sit by her window and watch the town below. Montezuma was a small place, strung out along the narrow valley with the San Juan Mountains rising steeply on all sides. The mining operations had slowed during the winter, but there were still plenty of people moving about their business, bundled against the cold that Delilah now had an even healthier respect for than before. On the second day of her confinement, Isaac Osborne appeared at her door with a bundle of wood for her stove and a pot of stew that he claimed Mrs. Patterson had sent up, though the older woman later confided with a knowing look that she had done no such thing. Isaac stayed for a while, sitting in the room's only other chair, and they talked about nothing in particular and everything at once. She learned that he was 26 years old, originally from Kansas, and had come to Colorado 5 years earlier hoping to make his fortune in the silver mines. That dream had not worked out, but he had discovered he had a talent for working with cattle and horses, and he found he preferred the honest work and open spaces to the dark, cramped tunnels beneath the earth. "What made you leave Philadelphia?" Isaac asked, and Delilah found herself telling him things she had not shared with anyone else in town. About her father's business failing, about the creditors who had taken everything they owned, about the humiliation of watching their furniture carried out into the street. About how her mother had died when Delilah was 16, and it had been just her and her father, and how he had aged a decade in the single year it had taken for everything to fall apart. "He stayed behind," she said quietly, "living with my aunt and uncle trying to find work. But there were no opportunities for him there, not at his age with his reputation ruined. The teaching position here was my chance to help, to send money back so maybe he could start over somewhere else." Isaac listened without judgment, and when she finished he simply nodded as though he understood completely. "My father lost his farm," he said. "Drought took the crops 3 years running, and the bank was not interested in sympathy. I left because there were too many mouths to feed and not enough food to go around. Figured I could do better out here, maybe send money back to my mother and my sisters." "Do you?" Delilah asked. "Send money back." "When I can," Isaac said. "It is not much, but it is something. That is all we can do sometimes. Just something, and hope it is enough." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the snow that had begun to fall outside the window. Delilah found herself studying his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hair curled slightly at his collar. She thought about how his arms had felt around her when he pulled her from the water, about the desperate urgency in his voice when he had asked if she could hear him. She thought about how safe she had felt despite the fact that she was dying, because someone cared enough to risk his own life to save hers. When Isaac left that evening, he promised to come back the next day, and he kept that promise. He kept it the day after that as well, and the day after that, until it became an accepted routine that Isaac Osborne would visit Delilah Drake every evening after he finished whatever work he had found for the day. Sometimes he brought food or wood, sometimes just himself and stories about the town and the people in it. Delilah began to look forward to these visits with an intensity that surprised and slightly frightened her. She had known this man for less than a week, and yet she found herself thinking about him constantly, replaying their conversations in her mind, remembering every detail of his face and voice. By the time the doctor cleared her to return to teaching, nearly 2 weeks had passed since the accident, and Delilah felt both eager to resume her duties and strangely reluctant to give up the quiet intimacy of those evening visits. But on her first day back at the schoolhouse, she arrived to find that someone had not only repaired the broken pump, but had also stacked a month's worth of firewood beside the stove and fixed the door that had never quite hung properly on its hinges. When she asked around, no one would admit to knowing who had done the work, but she saw Mrs. Patterson smile in that knowing way again, and Delilah felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the stove. Teaching in Montezuma was different from what Delilah had expected. The students ranged from 6 to 15 years old, children of miners and shopkeepers and the few ranchers who worked the high mountain meadows. Some came every day, eager to learn. Others appeared only sporadically, when their labor was not needed at home. But they were all bright and curious, and Delilah found herself genuinely enjoying the work despite the challenges of inadequate supplies and the cramped one-room schoolhouse that was too hot near the stove and too cold by the windows. Isaac continued to visit her in the evenings, now coming to the boarding house after supper to sit in the small parlor where Mrs. Patterson allowed her female boarders to receive gentlemen callers under her watchful eye. They talked about everything and nothing, their conversations ranging from philosophy to practical matters of daily survival in the harsh mountain environment. Isaac told her about the ranch where he worked in the summer, high up in the mountains where the wildflowers grew so thick in July that the meadows looked like painted tapestries. Delilah told him about Philadelphia, about libraries and theaters and museums, about a world that seemed impossibly far away from this small town clinging to the mountainside. "You miss it?" Isaac asked one evening in late February. Outside, another storm was raging, but inside the parlor the fire burned warm and bright. "The city, I mean, all those things you left behind." Delilah considered the question carefully. "Sometimes," she admitted. "I miss the convenience of it, the way you could have anything you wanted if you had the money to pay for it. I miss the library most of all, I think. The lending library near our house had thousands of books, and I could borrow as many as I wanted. What kind of books did you read? Isaac asked, leaning forward with genuine interest. Everything, Delilah said, smiling at the memory. Novels and poetry and history and science. I wanted to understand the world, to know about places I would never see and ideas I had never considered. My father used to say I had an insatiable curiosity. There is nothing wrong with that, Isaac said firmly. Wanting to learn, wanting to understand things, that is what makes us better than we were. What about you? Delilah asked. What would you want to learn about if you could? Isaac was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. I would like to learn more about raising cattle properly, he finally said. Not just herding them from place to place, but really understanding breeding and genetics and how to build up a good herd. I would like to have my own ranch someday, my own land with my own cattle, and I would like to do it right. The longing in his voice was unmistakable, and Delilah felt something tighten in her chest. She could picture it so clearly suddenly. Isaac on his own land, building something permanent and good, creating a legacy that could not be taken away by banks or drought or bad luck. And she realized with a start, she could picture herself there with him, standing on the porch of a house they had built together, watching the sun set over mountains that were beginning to feel like home. The thought should have terrified her, but instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. March came with its wild temperature swings, days warm enough to melt the snow alternating with nights cold enough to freeze everything solid again. The river began to flow more freely, and Delilah made a point of staying well away from it, keeping her promise to Isaac. The school year was progressing well, and several of her students had made remarkable improvement in their reading and mathematics. She was proud of them and proud of herself for sticking with the challenge when it would have been easier to give up and go back east. It was on a warm afternoon in mid-March that Isaac appeared at the schoolhouse door just as Delilah was dismissing her students for the day. He looked different somehow, nervous in a way she had never seen him before. The children streamed past him with cheerful goodbyes, and then they were alone in the schoolhouse with the afternoon sun streaming through the windows and dust motes dancing in the golden light. "Isaac," Delilah said, surprised, "is everything all right? You never come by during the day." "I needed to talk to you," Isaac said, taking off his hat and turning it in his hands. "And I could not wait until this evening because I was afraid I would lose my nerve." Delilah felt her heart begin to beat faster. She set down the slate she had been holding and gave him her full attention. "What is it?" Isaac took a deep breath, and when he looked at her, his green eyes were full of emotion so intense they took her breath away. "I have been offered a job," he said. "A good job, managing a ranch down near Durango. The pay is better than anything I could make around here, and there is a chance to buy into the operation eventually, to become a partner and maybe own part of the land someday." "Isaac, that is wonderful," Delilah said, and meant it even as her heart began to sink. Durango was more than 70 miles away, a full day's journey even in good weather. If he left, she would likely never see him again. "It would be wonderful," Isaac said, "except that it would mean leaving Montezuma. It would mean leaving you." Delilah felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "Isaac, no, let me finish," he said, stepping closer to her. "Delilah, I know we have only known each other for a few months. I know it is fast, probably too fast, and you are educated and refined, and you could do so much better than a cowboy with no prospects beyond hard work and hope. But I cannot imagine my life without you in it anymore. These past months, these evenings we have spent together, they have been the best of my life. You make me want to be better, to do better, to build something worth having." He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm and strong around hers. "Come with me to Durango," he said. "Marry me, Delilah. I know I cannot offer you much right now, but I swear I will work harder than any man alive to give you a good life. I will build us a home, and I will never stop trying to make you happy. Just say you will come with me. Say you will be my wife." Delilah looked at him, at this man who had saved her life and then somehow become her life. And she knew her answer before he had even finished asking the question. All those evenings talking, getting to know each other, learning each other's dreams and fears and hopes, they had been building to this moment. She thought about Philadelphia, about the life she had known there, about propriety and expectations and what people might think. Then she thought about Isaac's arms around her when he pulled her from the water, about his smile when he told her stories about the mountains, about the way he listened to her as though everything she said mattered. "Yes," she said, and watched his expression transform from nervous hope to pure joy. "Yes, Isaac, I will marry you. I will come with you to Durango, and I will build a life with you, and I cannot imagine anything I want more." Isaac let out a sound that was half laugh and half sob, and then he was pulling her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe but not caring one bit. His hand came up to cup her face with a gentleness that belied his strength, and when he kissed her, it was soft and sweet and full of promise. Delilah had been kissed before, chased pecks from boys back in Philadelphia who had courted her with proper restraint, but this was nothing like that. This was Isaac pouring everything he felt into a single perfect moment, and Delilah kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands fisting in his shirt as though she could hold him there forever. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Isaac rested his forehead against hers. "I was so afraid you would say no," he admitted. "I was so afraid you would think I was crazy or too presumptuous, or that you did not feel the same way." "I do feel the same way," Delilah assured him. "I have for weeks now, maybe since that first day when you saved me. I just did not know if you felt it too, if what we had was as special to you as it was to me." "It is," Isaac said fervently. "Delilah, you are the most special thing that has ever happened to me. I mean that with my whole heart." They began making plans immediately, speaking in quick, excited sentences that tumbled over each other. Isaac needed to leave for Durango by the end of April to start his new position when the spring season began, which gave them just over a month to arrange everything. Delilah would need to find a replacement teacher for the school, and they would need to get married before they left, because even in the informal society of mining town Colorado, a woman traveling with a man who was not her husband would cause talk that neither of them wanted. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Delilah wrote to her father in Philadelphia, telling him about Isaac and their plans, trying to convey in words on paper how this man had changed her life so completely. She found a young woman recently arrived from Denver who was willing to take over the teaching position, and she spent hours helping her prepare for the rowdy, wonderful students who would be her responsibility. Isaac worked extra hours at every job he could find, saving every penny toward their future, buying supplies they would need for the journey, and for setting up their new life in Durango. They were married on the last Saturday in April in a simple ceremony at the small church that served Montezuma's mixed Protestant population. Delilah wore a dress of deep blue wool that Mrs. Patterson had helped her sew, and Isaac wore his best clothes, his dark hair slicked back and his eyes shining with happiness. Most of the town turned out for the wedding. These people who had taken Delilah in when she had nowhere else to go, and who had watched the romance between the schoolteacher and the cowboy bloom over the winter months. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and told Isaac he could kiss his bride, He did so with such enthusiasm that the congregation burst into laughter and applause. Delilah felt her cheeks flush, but she was smiling too broadly to care about embarrassment. This was her wedding day, and she was marrying the man she loved, and nothing else mattered. The wedding celebration was held at the boarding house, with Mrs. Patterson and several other ladies providing food and drink. Someone produced a fiddle and there was dancing, despite the cramped quarters. Isaac spun Delilah around the parlor until she was breathless and laughing, and when he pulled her close for a slower dance, he whispered in her ear all the things he was looking forward to about their future together. Some of those things made her blush even deeper, but she found she was looking forward to them too, to the intimacy and closeness that would come with being truly his wife in every way. That night, in the small room that Isaac had rented for their wedding night, Delilah discovered that all the passion and intensity Isaac brought to everything else in his life extended to the marriage bed as well. He was gentle but not timid, patient but not passive, and he made her feel cherished and desired in equal measure. They learned each other's bodies with the same curiosity and openness they had brought to learning each other's minds and hearts. And when Delilah finally fell asleep wrapped in her husband's arms, she felt complete in a way she had never experienced before. They left Montezuma 2 days later, their belongings packed on a sturdy horse that Isaac had purchased with some of the advance pay from his new job. The journey to Durango took them through some of the most spectacular country Delilah had ever seen, following rough roads and trails that climbed over mountain passes and descended into valleys where rivers ran cold and clear. Isaac pointed out landmarks and told her stories about the history of the region, about the Ute people who had lived here long before white settlers arrived, about the mining camps and trading posts that had sprung up seemingly overnight when silver was discovered in the mountains. They camped under the stars at night, and Isaac showed Delilah how to cook over an open fire and how to read the weather in the clouds that gathered around the peaks. She found she loved this nomadic existence, the simplicity of it, the way it stripped away everything unnecessary and left only what truly mattered. Good food, warm blankets, and the company of the person you loved most in the world. Durango, when they finally reached it, was larger and more established than Montezuma, with brick buildings lining its wide streets and a sense of permanence that the mountain mining towns lacked. The ranch where Isaac would be working was another 10 miles out of town, situated in a broad valley where the land was gentler and more suited to grazing. The owner, a man named Samuel Brennan, was in his 60s and looking to slow down after decades of building his operation from nothing. He welcomed Isaac and Delilah warmly, showing them to a small cabin on the property that would be their home. The cabin was rough but solid, with 2 rooms and a stone fireplace and windows that looked out over the valley. Delilah walked through it slowly, imagining how it would look with curtains and furniture and all the small touches that would make it theirs. Isaac came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What do you think?" he asked. "Can you be happy here?" Delilah turned in his arms so she could look at him properly. "I can be happy anywhere as long as I am with you," she said honestly. "But yes, I think I can be very happy here. It is beautiful, Isaac, and it feels like a place where we can really build something." Isaac kissed her softly. "We will build something amazing," he promised. "You just watch." He was right. Over the next few years, they did exactly that. Isaac proved himself to be an exceptional ranch manager, with an instinct for cattle and horses that impressed even the experienced hands who had worked for Samuel Brennan for years. The ranch prospered under his leadership, and Brennan came to rely on him more and more, eventually offering him the partnership he had hoped for. Isaac seized the opportunity with both hands, investing everything they had saved into buying a share of the land and the herd. Delilah, meanwhile, discovered talents she had not known she possessed. She learned to ride horses, at first tentatively and then with genuine skill. She learned to help with the cattle when extra hands were needed, and she kept the books for the ranch with the same meticulous attention to detail she had once applied to grading her students' papers. She also started teaching again, not in a formal school but in a less formal way, working with the children of the ranch hands and neighboring families who had no access to regular education. She held lessons in their cabin or outside under the cottonwood trees when the weather was fine, and she loved it just as much as she had loved teaching in Montezuma. Their first child, a son they named James after Isaac's father, was born in the spring of 1886, 2 years after their wedding. Isaac was beside himself with joy, cradling the tiny baby in his large, work-roughened hands with a tenderness that made Delilah fall in love with him all over again. He was a devoted father, spending every free moment with James, telling him stories and singing him songs and making plans for all the things they would do together when the boy was older. 2 years later, a daughter arrived, and they named her Rose because Delilah said she was as beautiful and perfect as the wild roses that bloomed in the meadows. Isaac was just as smitten with his daughter as he had been with his son, and Delilah often found him rocking her to sleep in the evening, his deep voice rumbling softly with lullabies while the firelight flickered on the cabin walls. By 1890, Isaac had bought out Samuel Brennan's remaining share of the ranch, becoming the sole owner of the property and herd. It was a massive undertaking, requiring him to take on debt that made Delilah nervous, but Isaac was confident in his ability to make the ranch profitable enough to pay off the loans and still provide well for their family. He worked harder than ever, often from dawn until well after dark, but he never forgot to make time for Delilah and the children, never let his ambition override what truly mattered. Delilah continued her teaching, now working with more than a dozen students from the surrounding area. She also helped establish a small lending library in Durango, donating books and organizing fundraisers to purchase more. It was not the grand Philadelphia library of her youth, but it was something, and she was proud of what they had built. She was proud of everything they had built, actually. The thriving ranch, the happy children, the life they had created together through hard work and love and unwavering commitment to each other. In the summer of 1891, they took the children on a camping trip high into the mountains, to the meadows Isaac had told Delilah about during those early evening conversations in Montezuma. She had thought his descriptions were exaggerations, but if anything, he had undersold the beauty of the place. The wildflowers really did grow so thick that the ground was a riot of color. Purple lupines and red paintbrushes and yellow sunflowers and blue columbines all mixed together in glorious profusion. They camped beside a crystal-clear stream, and Isaac taught James to fish while Delilah picked flowers with Rose, weaving them into crowns that they wore like royalty. One evening, after the children were asleep in the tent, Isaac and Delilah sat by the fire watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The night was mild and perfect, and Delilah felt a contentment so deep it was almost overwhelming. She thought about how far she had come from that desperate young woman who had arrived in Colorado on a train 7 years earlier, alone and afraid and uncertain of the future. She thought about the frozen river that had nearly killed her, about the strong arms that had pulled her to safety, about the green eyes that had looked at her with fear and relief and the beginning of love. "What are you thinking about?" Isaac asked, his arm coming around her shoulders to pull her closer. "Everything," Delilah said softly. "About how I ended up here, about how different my life is from what I ever imagined it would be. About how you saved me that day on the river, and how you have been saving me every day since in 100 small ways." Isaac was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "You know," he said finally, "I think about that day a lot too. About how close I came to not being there, to being just a few minutes later, or taking a different route, or not looking at the river at that exact moment. About how I could have lost you before I ever really had you." "But you did not," Delilah said, turning to look at him in the firelight. "You were there exactly when I needed you, and you have been there ever since. You gave me a life I love, Isaac. You gave me a home and a family and a purpose. You gave me everything." "You gave me everything too," Isaac said, his voice rough with emotion. "Before you, I was just drifting, working towards some vague idea of what I wanted without really understanding what mattered. You showed me what mattered. You showed me that building something real means building it with someone you love, someone who makes every bit of the work worthwhile." He kissed her then, soft and sweet under the stars, and Delilah felt the same flutter in her chest that she had felt that very first day when he had looked at her with those green eyes, and she had known, somehow, that her life had just changed forever. Some things, she thought, never stopped being true no matter how much time passed. The years continued to roll by, each one bringing its own challenges and triumphs. There was the drought of 1893 that tested Isaac's skills as a rancher and forced them to drive the cattle to higher pastures where the grass still grew. There was the winter of 1895 when a terrible storm killed dozens of cattle, and they had to work around the clock for days to save the rest of the herd. There were good years, too, when the calves were strong and numerous, and the prices were high, and they could afford little luxuries that felt like enormous victories. James grew into a serious boy who loved the ranch as much as his father did, following Isaac around and imitating everything he did. Rose was more like her mother, loving books and learning but also possessing a fierce independence that sometimes exasperated and always delighted her parents. In 1896, another son arrived, and they named him Daniel. He was a happy, easy baby who seemed to take life as it came, and he completed their family in a way that felt exactly right. Delilah's father came to visit in 1897, making the long journey from Philadelphia, where he had finally found stable employment working as a clerk for one of his former competitors. He stayed for 2 months, and Delilah watched with happiness as he got to know his son-in-law and his grandchildren, as he came to understand the life she had built so far from everything they had known. On the day he left, he pulled her aside and told her he was proud of her, that she had done better than he ever could have hoped, and that her mother would have been proud too. Delilah cried as she watched the stagecoach carry him away, but they were good tears, tears of closure and acceptance and joy. By 1900, the ranch was one of the most successful operations in the region, and Isaac's reputation as a cattleman had spread far beyond the valley. He was offered positions managing larger ranches in other states, but he always turned them down. This was their land, their home, and he had no interest in starting over somewhere else. He had everything he wanted right here: his family, his work, and the woman he loved more with every passing year. Delilah continued teaching, now helping to organize a proper school in town, and serving on the board that oversaw its operation. She never forgot her own experience as a desperate young teacher in a rough mining town, and she worked hard to ensure that the teachers they hired were supported and valued. She also wrote occasional articles for the Durango newspaper about education and women's issues, using the platform to advocate for the things she believed in. Their children grew and flourished. James announced at 16 that he wanted to work the ranch with his father, and Isaac could not have been more pleased. Rose talked about becoming a teacher like her mother, or maybe even going to college in Denver to study literature. Daniel was still young, but showed signs of having inherited his father's easy way with animals and his mother's love of learning. They were good kids, growing into good people, and both Isaac and Delilah felt blessed beyond measure. In the spring of 1902, nearly 20 years after Isaac had pulled Delilah from the frozen river in Montezuma, they took a trip back to that small mountain town. The mining operations had played out by then, and many people had moved away, but the town still existed, quieter and smaller, but still hanging on. They walked down to the river, now flowing full and fast with snowmelt, and stood on the bank looking at the place where Delilah had gone through the ice all those years ago. "It seems impossible that it really happened," Delilah said, holding Isaac's hand tightly. "Like something from a dream or a story someone told me, not something I actually experienced." "It happened," Isaac said. "And I thank God every single day that I was there, that I saw you go under, that I was able to get you out in time. Everything good in my life started that day, Delilah." "Everything." "For me too," Delilah agreed. "I thought I was coming to Colorado to save my life in a practical sense, to escape poverty and have a chance at a future. But the truth is, my real life did not start until the day I fell through the ice and you pulled me out, until I met you." Isaac turned to face her fully, his hands coming up to frame her face the way he had done so many times over the years. His green eyes were as bright and intense as they had been when he was 26, though now there was silver in his dark hair and lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. "I love you," he said simply. "I have loved you from almost the first moment I saw you, and I will love you until the day I die and beyond that if such things are possible." "I love you too," Delilah said, rising on her toes to kiss him. "Always and forever, Isaac. That is my promise to you." They stayed in Montezuma for 3 days, visiting with the few people they still knew there, walking the streets and remembering how things had been. They visited the old schoolhouse where Delilah had taught, now standing empty and starting to fall into disrepair. They went to the boarding house where Mrs. Patterson had watched over their courtship, only to learn that the old woman had passed away the previous winter, mourned by everyone who had known her. They attended a service at the little church where they had been married, and afterward they stood outside looking at the mountains that rose on all sides, the peaks still capped with snow even though it was May. "Are you glad we came back?" Isaac asked as they prepared to leave. "Yes," Delilah said. "This place will always be important to us, always be part of our story. I am glad we could see it again, remember where we started." They returned to Durango and to the ranch, to their children and their work and the life they had built. The years continued to pass, each one adding new layers to their story. James married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring property and started building his own herd on land Isaac had set aside for him. Rose did go to college in Denver, studying literature, and coming home with her head full of ideas about writing and poetry. Daniel decided he wanted to be a veterinarian, fascinated by animal medicine, and willing to work hard to achieve his goal. Isaac and Delilah grew older together, their hair turning gray, their bodies bearing the marks of decades of hard work and hard living. But their love never diminished, never became routine or tired. They still sat together by the fire in the evenings, still talked for hours about everything and nothing, still looked at each other with eyes that saw past the weathered exterior to the person underneath, who had captured their heart so completely all those years ago. In 1910, at the age of 48, Delilah became a grandmother when James and his wife had a son. Isaac was delighted to become a grandfather, showering the baby with the same attention and affection he had given his own children. They spent many happy hours watching James work with his son the way Isaac had once worked with James, passing down knowledge and skills and values from one generation to the next. The ranch continued to thrive under their stewardship, and they took pride in knowing that they had built something that would outlast them, something that their children and grandchildren could build upon in turn. They had come to Colorado with nothing but hope and determination, and they had created a legacy that was as solid and enduring as the mountains themselves. When Delilah turned 50 in 1912, Isaac threw her a party that brought together people from all over the region. Friends and neighbors, former students and their parents, business associates and family, all gathered to celebrate the woman who had touched so many lives with her kindness and intelligence and determination. There were speeches and toasts, and Isaac gave one that made Delilah cry with happiness. "My wife is the strongest person I have ever known," Isaac said, looking at her with unmistakable love. She survived being trapped under the ice of a frozen river, but more than that, she survived everything that came after. The uncertainty and hardship of frontier life, the challenges of building a home from nothing, the 1,000 daily difficulties that come with ranching in high country. She did more than survive, though. She thrived. She raised 3 amazing children. She educated dozens more. She built a library and supported her community and made this valley a better place just by being in it. I am the luckiest man alive because she chose to spend her life with me, and I will spend the rest of my days trying to be worthy of that choice. Delilah stood up and went to him, not caring that everyone was watching, and kissed him soundly to the cheers and applause of their guests. When she pulled back, she whispered in his ear, "You have been worthy of that choice every single day since the moment you pulled me from that river. Never doubt that for a single moment." The party went late into the night, with music and dancing and stories that ranged from hilarious to heartwarming. At one point, Delilah found herself standing on the porch of their house, looking out at the gathering and feeling overwhelmed with gratitude for the life she had been given. She thought about that terrified young woman who had walked out onto unstable ice because she was too proud to ask for help, and she barely recognized herself in that person anymore. She had been so lost then, so uncertain of who she was or what she wanted. Isaac had helped her find herself, had given her the space and support to become the person she was meant to be. As if summoned by her thoughts, Isaac appeared beside her, slipping his arm around her waist in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the years. "Having a good time?" he asked. "The best time," Delilah assured him. "Thank you for this, Isaac, for all of it, for everything you have given me over the years." "You have given me just as much," Isaac said. "More, probably. I was just a drifting cowboy before I met you. You gave me a reason to build something permanent, to put down roots and create a real home. You gave me a family and a purpose and more happiness than I ever imagined possible." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their guests dance and laugh, watching their children and grandchildren enjoy the celebration. This was what they had built together, Delilah thought. Not just the physical ranch and the financial success, but this: a community, a family, a web of connections and relationships that enriched everyone it touched. This was their true legacy. The years rolled on into the teens and then the 20s. Rose published a book of poetry that was well received, and she married a professor from the college in Denver, giving Delilah and Isaac 2 more grandchildren. Daniel graduated from veterinary school, and opened a practice in Durango, where he quickly became known as the best animal doctor in the region. James expanded his ranching operation, buying additional land and building his herd into something impressive. All three of their children were happy and successful, building good lives for themselves, and both Isaac and Delilah took tremendous pride in how they had turned out. In 1924, they celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary with another big party, this one even larger than Delilah's 50th birthday celebration had been. They had been married for 4 decades, together for even longer than that if you counted the months of courtship in Montezuma. They had built a life that exceeded anything either of them could have imagined when they started out, and they had done it together, supporting and encouraging each other every step of the way. Isaac was 66 now, and Delilah was 62. They moved a bit slower than they once had, and they had turned over most of the active ranch management to James, but they were still sharp and engaged with the world. Isaac still rode out to check on the cattle most days, and Delilah still tutored students who were struggling in school. They still sat by the fire every evening, still talked and laughed and held hands like newlyweds. 40 years, Isaac said wonderingly as they danced together at their anniversary party, moving slowly to music played by a string quartet they had hired from Durango. How is it possible that 40 years have passed? It feels like yesterday that I was asking you to marry me in that schoolhouse in Montezuma. It feels both like yesterday and like a lifetime ago, Delilah said, resting her head against his shoulder. We have lived so much life together, Isaac. We have seen so many things and done so many things, but through all of it, the best part has always been coming home to you at the end of the day. That is the best part for me too, Isaac agreed. Knowing that no matter what happened during the day, no matter how hard the work or how difficult the challenges, I would get to spend the evening with you. That has made everything worthwhile. They danced until late, surrounded by family and friends, celebrating not just their anniversary but the incredible journey they had taken together. As the party finally wound down and people began to leave, Isaac and Delilah stood together on their porch one more time, watching the stars come out over the valley that had been their home for 4 decades. You ever regret it? Delilah asked quietly. Leaving Kansas, coming west, all the hardship and uncertainty you went through before we met? Not for a single second, Isaac said immediately. Every hard moment, every setback, every failure brought me to that riverbank in Montezuma on the exact day you needed someone to pull you out. If I had made different choices, taken a different path, I might never have met you, and that would have been the greatest tragedy of my life. I feel the same way, Delilah said. Even the worst parts, even losing everything in Philadelphia and having to start over in a strange place, even falling through the ice and nearly dying, I would go through all of it again because it led me to you. Isaac turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. His green eyes, still bright despite his age, looked at her with the same intensity they had held 40 years earlier when he had proposed. I love you, Delilah Osborne, he said. I loved you when you were a young teacher shivering beside a stove, and I love you now as a grandmother with silver in your hair. I will love you in every version of yourself that exists, for all the time we have left and beyond. I love you too, Isaac Osborne, Delilah replied, tears streaming down her face. You saved my life that day on the river, and you have been saving it every day since by filling it with joy and purpose and love. You are my hero, my partner, my best friend, and the greatest blessing I have ever known. They kissed there on the porch under the stars, 2 people who had built an extraordinary life together from the most ordinary of beginnings. Their story had started with ice and water and desperate fear, but it had become something beautiful and enduring, something that would be remembered and told for generations to come. They had proven that love could conquer anything, that two people with nothing but determination and devotion could build an empire of the heart that was worth more than all the gold and silver in the mountains. As they finally went inside, arms wrapped around each other, the valley lay peaceful and quiet around them. The ranch they had built together stretched out in all directions, a testament to their hard work and vision. Their children and grandchildren slept safely in homes of their own, carrying forward the values and lessons Isaac and Delilah had taught them. And somewhere far away, in a small mountain town that was slowly fading into history, a river flowed over the place where a young woman had once broken through the ice, and a cowboy had pulled her to safety, starting a love story that would last a lifetime and beyond.